welcome back to the second part of the interview of my guest today, Tom Reichert, Global CEO of ERM. Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's great to be here.
So, Tom, I'm going to ask you a tricky question. How many countries have you traveled to?
I don't, Stephanie, to be honest, I've stopped counting. 50, 60, maybe more. Like I get around everywhere. I've had global roles for probably 15, 20 years, of my life. And so I go wherever, something happens, where clients are, where interesting things are happening across the world.
So you're a true global citizen.
I travel with 2 passports, with 2 countries, and that allows me to manage the visas and everything else around that. And I think that's what you need. And getting to countries and getting to different locations, I think is critical to understand what happens. There's that much we can do with Teams and Zoom, but you don't really get the underlying context under which people are operating.
Sure. Is there any like a country or city, you've been there, you feel like you know the city really well, but when you are there physically, are there any like surprises to you? Have that ever occurred to you?
Or
only if you are there physically, as you said, Zoom, reading or watching videos, right? So we know pretty much about international cities and countries, but once you are physically there, you might experience something different.
It is always that way. And look, the reason I think this is the case is people operate in the context that they live in, and that context has a longer term part that's a more cultural one, and that probably stays steady, and there's a learning experience. When you go once or twice, you start figuring out what those parts are. But there's also lots of momentum change in countries and in dynamics, and that is true in many Western countries. Like I think traveling in the UK over the last couple of years has been substantial change through the whole changes of governments there. I know you're from China. Traveling China, I've been in China for the last 15 years, probably every year. It's changed enormously. And a lot of those things you actually only realize when you have a timeline of your experiences year after year. This is what it was when I was here last year, and now it's this way. Or this was what it was like 5 years ago. And I personally believe you've got to be out there to understand the context under which people operate. Because everybody is rational in what they're doing. We just don't always understand why that is rational. And if we judge it against our own context, which we consider to be rational, but is a different one, then we come to the wrong conclusion about what somebody else says, why they say it, or why they don't say it.
Yeah. So you mentioned a very important point, which is basically about understanding people. People coming from different culture, coming from different country, they might have a different map in terms of the how do they view a problem, how do they perceive the information, and then how do they act upon the same information.
Totally right. To give you an example, we train ourselves, and I'm sure here in the business school, that it's very important to speak up, in meetings, also in big meetings. And I know our daughter studies here, so I know from a lot of the training that we provide is be bold to speak up in class, in groups. There are other cultures and countries where that is not appropriate or not encouraged. So when you run a global leadership meeting that has a sort of folks who grew up and got educated in the US, and you have a set of folks who have been in other parts of the world where that's not the case, you might be surprised that 60-70% of the airspace is with the folks who come from the US. But you run a global company, and it's got to be inclusive, and you have to involve other people, and you have to understand them. And so finding ways to change the dynamics of the meetings is very important. But in order to do that, you need to understand what the context of the other participants is. And you only get that when you're out where they live to understand their environment, their context, socially, politically, much better.
Yeah, speaking of managing a company with multiple culture and then people, right? So ERM has operate in 40 countries, right?
There are 40 countries, 150
offices,
8,000 people.
8,000 people
and
across the world, right?
Everywhere, yes.
Yeah, everywhere.
And we have a history as ERM. We work in for the last 50 years mainly with multinational companies. And originally a lot were in the extractive industries, mining and so on. Now it's moved to technology and consumer. But when you work in the extractive industries, you needed locations everywhere. Wherever there's a mine somewhere in Africa or a refinery somewhere in Asia, you have to operate in those contexts. So we have a tradition of having teams everywhere or working with communities or subcontractors in any part and any piece of the world.
Yeah, we always call that, it's called simultaneously liability of foreigners and then also some assets of foreigners.
Totally.
So as a foreign, so you might have some liability just because you are outsider, you are unfamiliar with the local information. But meanwhile, as a foreigner, because of your foreigners, you might have some unique perspective. You might see things like local do not see. So you might have certain inherited some of the advantages. So what do you see in your managing role as global CEO? What do you see the advantages and liability of foreigners?
I think that's right. Having said that, I think the more time you spend, the more context you understand, the better you get in your judgment. And so the outside-in perspectives, the first time you go somewhere, are probably mostly wrong. Because you're still a judge against your context. So, like, what my approach to this is, the first time is I really go and I just want to listen. I want to listen and learn and understand as much as I can, about people and ask questions, for it. Answers are more for the second trip, meaning, at some point you work out what the context is and what you actually need to achieve as an organization, for us at ERM or with our clients, and then the questions can get to, all right, in the context that you're operating and what we need to achieve, for example, in the world and the overall net zero targets, why don't we think about this part and that part? But I think that engagement and involvement is very, very important. What is dangerous is if you take your context, you travel somewhere and you use that as, oh, it's interesting you're doing it this way, but we do it this way, and why don't you do that? And you get actually connected to your starting point. That is where I think you can go wrong very, very quickly, because then you deal also with the point that we raised before. Not everybody is comfortable speaking up. So you think you made your point, you did great, you told them what to do, they will do this. Actually, they think you're totally on the wrong boat. It's just a culture in which people don't speak up to the CEO or a senior foreigner.
Yeah, so that's so interesting. So you need to really foster a good culture, a good platform for everyone to participate and then to voice, and then so that we make sure we understand each other.
That's correct.
So that makes me really curious. So what's the typical day looks like for you as a global CEO? So do you mind sharing that with our student, or do you actually have a typical day?
So typically in content doesn't really exist. I mean, the topics move around. Typically in structure does exist. So, I'm probably half of my time traveling, and the other half I operate, we live in New Jersey, I operate from there. So when I travel, I'll give you an example. I was in Indianapolis yesterday meeting with our team. That was a very typical day. I get up early, I go to the gym, then I meet all partners and senior leaders for breakfast. That is an opportunity to re-engage, and to our conversation just now, to see how people feel, what's on their mind, what they like about what I decided and told them over the last couple of months, what they liked and what they didn't like. And luckily here in Indianapolis, I get a pretty open set of feedback, so that's great. Then I go out, see a set of clients, our most important or very important clients, where we do work and get feedback and input and other things that we could be doing. I go back, do a lunch meeting with all of our staff. That's an open door policy for everybody to talk or observe or ask questions. And then I do a set of smaller meetings with individual service lines or client teams, a dinner with the partners to reflect on the day, and get to hear a couple of things that we want to do together. That's a travel day. A day at home is get up, get on the phone, like usually I start at 7 a.m. We have our headquarters in the UK, so I have to bridge a bit of the time zones. But I try and start early, and that way I can also get Asia still in their evenings. I know it gets out of their hours often, but that works. And so it's usually back-to-back calls till noon or 1 p.m. A bit of a breather to clean up what happened during the day, and then keep on going for the afternoon and see what else happens. And then I try and finish 7 p.m.-ish or so that I still have some time in the evening for something else. Those are the two types of days I have.
Wow, so that's so interesting. So I hear a couple of things, like even for the travel day and normal day, I hear some similarity would be start really early, so hardworking. And then you also mentioned a couple times about reflection. So I think, we always study CEOs. We study what are the common, characteristics or personalities or profiles CEO typically have. So if I ask you, what are some of the traits or things you think are important, what would that be?
I do think there are many CEOs and many CEO types, and many are successful in different ways. What matters to me in my role are a couple of things. First of all, a clear direction of where we want to be as a firm. So, ERM has a purpose of shape a sustainable future with the world's leading organizations. There's not a single major meeting that I wouldn't talk about our purpose and how that translates to the three most important priorities, which change a bit over time, but they have an umbrella that allows us to unite as a team. The next piece is spend plenty of time in the work environment that our teams have. That is with clients, because I need to understand what our teams do every day, what works and what doesn't work, what our clients have to say about that. And then spend time with teams to understand what makes them excited, what frustrates them as well, and how we can adjust. So I think the real proximity to what the business actually is, so that you don't end up lofty with outside-in comments, is critical for a CEO. You have to be grounded, and so that's why I'm on the road all the time, to get that feeling that people will not tell me on the call, but I get that practical, experience around it. That, in my mind, are some of the most important parts. And then there's a lot of other things that you have to manage, of course. The risk of an organization, engagement with shareholders, like all the normal pieces. But you can actually handle them from everywhere. Usually, we all have good teams who help us do that.
So, what part of the job you enjoy the most?
I enjoy most when I can work with people to create new things. So for me, it's always been about innovation, and it's been co-creation, with teams. That's why I also stayed in the professional services, in the people businesses so much, because I get all my energy from joint collaboration, joint activities, that we do, and then see people take them up, find their mission, find their team, and then just do amazing things.
We alluded this earlier about the way of working with people coming from different countries, different cultural background, right? So what's your secret of working with people coming from completely different cultural background, and then as you talk about co-creation and then co-work, problem solving, and then find some new innovation. So what's your secret?
Well, we all learn our way on that. I don't think there are many secrets. You learn, you get things right, you don't get things right, on the journey. The things that have worked for me is, I think a lot about the teams that I put together. That starts with my own leadership team, and I deeply believe that diverse or heterogeneous backgrounds, come to better solutions. So the team that I have at ERM, that is my leadership team, it's probably half of folks who have been at ERM before I joined 2.5 years ago, and half is from the outside. Some are next generation leaders, some have been leaders, for 20, 30 years in the organization. It's culturally very diverse, it's gender-wise diverse, and so that gives me a microcosm of the organization, and it allows also me to form smaller teams with different backgrounds to solve different problems, and I'm quite careful about who I put together for these types of things. And then that cascades throughout the organization, for where we try and look at multidisciplinary teams to solve topics and spend more time with each other, because then you're not so rushed and you can listen a bit more. And that's not the fastest process. The fastest process is homogeneity. Same background, same thinking, but that's also how you go wrong. And particularly when you operate a global organization, I think you need heterogeneity, and it might sometimes take a bit longer, but you're going to come up with better answers.
Yeah, so it's like you're socializing and then building trust takes some time so that we can eventually reach out some creativity, it seems like.
Yes.
So speaking of that, a lot of the listeners are actually considering international business as a co-major. So in your view, how important having a international perspective and or global mindset, as many of the students are like entry level in the job market, how that important? And like you are a CEO, right? So for the entry level employees, and a lot of them might work with a domestic company, will that having international perspective still very important and relevant?
I'd say, let me say that this way. Exposing yourself to things that are not familiar to you will always be helpful. You don't know where you end up. You think you work for a domestic company and suddenly they acquire a company in Korea and suddenly they make you the project manager for the integration of the company in Korea. You can't say, hang on, that's not what I signed up for. Well, you can say that maybe once, but you can't say it 2 or 3 times. I didn't sign up for that. I want to work domestically. So the optionalities of life or things that can happen, we all don't know, and so the more openness you have and the more familiar you get with learning different backgrounds, different cultures that can be international, that can also be between business and science or research and sales, like things that have very, very different background on how you operate, is only going to be a win because you're going to be confronted throughout your career all the time with different environments. And if you learn how to cope with different environments, then you have a wonderful skill set, for your success going forward. International is just one of the dimensions. It's always been an important one. For me, I grew up in an international family. My wife is American, I'm German. We lived 10 years in Australia. 2 of our kids are Australian. Then we moved to the US for the last 16 years. Our 3rd kid was born here. We show up with a whole collection of differently colored passports every time we travel. That is just us. This was the dimension that mattered a lot, to us, and I couldn't imagine operating any different in the world these days anymore.
I really like you talk about it's really like open-minded, right? So open to new, diverse, different things, which might open up a lot of opportunities for you in the future.
That's correct.
Rather than narrow-minded or close-minded.
And that in a world that is so, I don't think it's going to become less turbulent than what it is right now. We have to get used. Adaptability is going to be a key topic, for leaders, going forward. And so, the earlier you get used to that, the better that is going to be.
Yeah. So Tom, if you can time travel, so if you can travel back 20 years ago, are there anything you're gonna do differently?
Gee, 20 years, that's a while, So 20 years ago, so what was my life then? I just became, a partner I was with BCG for 27 years before I joined ERM, so a long, long time. So I just became partner in Australia.
Maybe I should ask if you can travel 30 years ago. But please go on.
Okay, well, it shows you how old I am, So our first child was just born, at that point. So at that point, you just try and keep your head above water, that's what I did. Now, what was quite interesting, what might be a learning that might be helpful for many of you as well is, in these pressure moments, the pressure of the job are more immediate. You have particular KPIs to deliver, clients behave that way, everybody wants something from you, your phone rings, your email opens. The pressure from your family situation, from a personal situation, is not so apparent. My wife didn't send me emails or doing this and that, but and I probably reacted more to the pressures of the job than what actually the pressures or the reactions on the personal side would have been. Now in the long term, the personal side is much more important to me than the job side. And so had I had a chance, I would go back and prioritize the way it really matters to me, namely my personal life over my professional life, and that might be just something to be sensitive all at the time about.
That's so insightful, because we always talk about fulfillment, right? So you do have this personal fulfillment and professional fulfillment. And then today we always talk about so-called work-life balance, which is so hard, particularly given the audience. Many of those are MBA students in their early 30s, right? So are there any advice you would give to people to, on the one hand, as you said, there's a demanding job, so they need to really crack this professional glass ceiling, whatever, so they need to really work hard towards the next level. But meanwhile, this is the age that families started to have like more and more requirement of their time and attention.
It's we find our pathways. I can share mine. I'm really careful about giving advice on all that life, for everyone else, but what was very important for me was to have reasonably clear boundaries. And I learned that 20 years ago, maybe not perfectly, 15 years ago until now, I've certainly learned that what I do and what I don't do. When kids had events at school or graduate from IU in the next summer, I'll be there. That is in the diary now, for in 12 months out. And my assistant knows it's a non-negotiable, those types of things don't get moved. I think those types of moves are very, very important. And then you can structure it, properly. The other part is how good of a multitasker are you? So for me, I can quite easily on the weekend take a phone call. I pick up the phone, I talk about something, I hang up, and I go back to what I do personally. Some other people think about that is, oh, this phone call is going to come, an hour before I start thinking about it. It takes me 2 hours afterwards to calm down, whatever happened on that phone call. And so therefore it takes a lot more of your personal weekend time, for it. We all make different choices. That's what I say. It's like, I've learned over the years to disconnect pretty quickly. It's a phone call, it finishes, I forget about it, I come back to it at some other point. And those are types of maybe life experiences, but also personal, reflections in how you handle these types of situations.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned about reflection a couple of times. I can see that you are really a person who will actually reflect on what you do and then learn from what you do, and then also
you better do, because like that, there's no life learning book,
right.
do exactly these things. You've got to keep on coming back to, what you do, and what has worked and what hasn't worked. And also now in my role, a lot of my role is to give energy to others in the organization. And so I need to have enough energy to be able to do that. When you look at, I think many CEO trainer books don't talk so much about that, how important it is for leaders to give energy to everyone else around. That creates motivation, that creates excitement. But in order to do that, you can't always run on empty. You've got to figure out how you sleep enough, how you eat healthy, how you spend time in a personal life, how you do exercise, like all the types of things that often we say we have no time for. Well, if you have no time, you have no energy, you can't give energy. And the more we are leaders, the more we have to be able to give the energy.
Very true. So we need to know ourselves better. We need to know the boundaries. We need to set the boundaries and then also carry out the boundaries and then also reflect the boundaries. As you said, we need to be sustainable, right? Even as individual.
We do.
So Tom, what city or country do you like the most to live? I mean, that's a sort of a personal question.
Look, for us, life in Australia has been wonderful. It's a wonderful, country. We lived in Sydney. We had great experiences. We had a young family. And Caroline and I, my wife and me, it was just great 10 years. It's just very far away. But if you think the other way around is, what have some of the more insightful experiences, been, for us? I think they've all been, back to the start of this conversation, when I was able to immerse in countries that I was traveling. So, for example, I've just been a couple of months back in Japan, where we did a joint venture together with Sumitomo Trust Bank, for it. And the celebration of that was a dinner with senior executives in a very Japanese setting, over many hours in the evening with simultaneous translation. It's a very special moment, if you haven't done that. Like, you look at somebody who's speaking at you, but you don't understand what the person says, and then there's somebody else next to you who speaks, and you have to listen, and you have to look at somebody. It's not something that we're used to, so it's a very important life learning experience, and I will not forget, that evening. Or I was in India a couple of years back at an offsite of a technology company, and the job in the evening was for the whole leadership team to split up in teams and cook dinner. And my job as the foreigner from the outside was to test what every team did. Now, that was quite the experience. A lot of spices, you don't know exactly what you're eating. After the 30 or 40 tries, I was happy it was done, but it was just a very special experience, to then engage with teams on something that they're passionate about, and that they created. And it gives you a very different exposure and a very different relationship. With people out there.
So that was actually my next question. I was going to ask, if you can engineer a profile so that you can take a piece of something you admire from different culture, right, and then put them together, what the profile would be? So something from Asia, something from Europe, something from North America. So all the things like you really admire or you learned in your journey?
I think they're very different parts. I'm not sure it's always country specific so easy, but maybe we use some of the dominant traits. I do think the US learnings are a lot about sharpness of thinking and very engaging communication. I'm German. That's not necessarily how I grew up. I learned a bit. You'll all be judges whether I can do that now, or not. So, but that has helped me, more and more to communicate on a global basis with large, teams. I'd say out of the European experience, I've taken away that, you need to find consensus and a socially acceptable norm across the board. For it, it's not all about me being successful. It is about how a society is successful, and a lot of the balancing in Europe is about exactly that, part. I'd say a lot of the Asian countries, even though they're very different, and you know that better than I do, for it, a general sense on humility and harmony, and a deeper reflection on long-standing values of the world, whether they be religion or whether they be just generally how countries operate. For it is a very helpful part. And then I would add to your point, the Latin piece, fun and energy, makes a big difference, when teams come together.
Right. So I like how you started with, it's not necessarily a country profile, it's really individual, right? So today we see a lot of global citizens, yourself included, and then also like the new generation, they grew up with YouTube, they grew up with TikTok, so they are so exposed to different views, different perspective. So speaking of that, what's your view about the social media? I mean, that's so certainly a double-edged sword, right? So on the one hand, it enhance connectivity among us with every corner of the world. On the other hand, how do we manage this information exploding?
Well, look, so I'm not sure we can decide still to turn our back, or not. This is just the way it is. It's the same conversation as when mobile phones appeared. Before we didn't have them, then we had them suddenly, and everybody was like, well, you're on your phone in a meeting, and like, how bad is that? And shouldn't we be talking to each other? And
yeah.
I think that's just evolution of the world. And we talk about technology advancements and new things, and that is part of the world. It comes again back to you as an individual, because how I think about that is where you spend your time and how you engage and what you think is information that is relevant, that makes you better as a leader, better as a person, for it, and make the choices. I don't think we can say, oh, this is to be blamed on the mobile phone. Oh, this is to be blamed on social media, for it. We have our own responsibilities and our abilities to adapt to the environment that we operate in. I'm probably not the biggest social media person, because for what I believe in, what matters to me, it doesn't create so much. But I use it for very diverse information. I do that absolutely. For it. And so again, we have to find our parts. I don't think this is good or bad. Mobile phone is not good or bad. Is we have to make our own choices, and that is probably the piece to figure out more and more for every of the students, everybody who's joining there. This is for me, it's a lifelong journey to pick the pieces that we believe make us better in the strive to be better contributor to the environment that we operate in.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. So Tom, one final question. So if you're going to give some advice to the listeners, they are as consumer or as employees, what can we do individually to help sustainability? Yeah. To
help sustainability, I think everybody contributes to that every day. And first of all is, I do think a good amount of understanding of what impact we have by what, how water challenged we actually really are, seriously, what actually happens with all the plastic packaging, of all the products that we buy in the supermarket, seriously, and do we want that, because I think an understanding, like in so many other business problems, is an understanding of the environment we're in and what actually happens is the key for us to be able to find solutions and to change our own path of action, So understand that in your environment, that you operate, then think about what you do in your personal life and in your job life. That is, in your personal life, what do you do with garbage? Do you put it into different bins or you don't? Do you turn the light off in your house, when you leave it? Do you turn the air conditioning down? And then the same applies in your job. What are you doing there? How resourceful? How do you deal with the resources that you have at work? And I think that creates the sustainable, responsible behavior that we all think about. It's just got to be an active part of our thinking every day, because it is a world that is clearly challenged. We are creating so much landfill parts. We're putting so much into oceans. We know the temperatures in oceans are increasing all the time. It leads to hurricanes like what we've just witnessed
Yes.
in Florida, North Carolina, and the states around that.